Welcome everybody to the next of our lunchtime research events during COVID-19. This is our session on theatre in time of plague. And I'd like to start with a thanks to one of my colleagues, Professor Deborah Cartmel, whose idea it was that we have this panel as a special event to coincide with the anniversary of Shakespeare's birthday. And I'm going to be very pleased to be welcoming a very exciting panel of guests who we will be talking to shortly. And as you'll have seen from the description of the event, what we're hoping to do is reflect on both the impact of the current pandemic on the world of theatre, but also how this maybe compares and contrasts with the similar sorts of impacts of plague back in the days of Shakespeare himself and his contemporaries. So we're going to be talking to people from the theatre world, and we're going to be talking to people from the world of kind of theatre history to have what I hope will be a fascinating discussion. So we're going to start off with an introduction to each of our speakers. And to begin with myself, I'm Professor Siobhan Keenan. I'm an Associate Dean for Research in Humanities, but I'm also a Professor of Shakespeare and Renaissance Literature, hence being very excited about getting to hear the conversation today. On our panel, the first of our speakers will be Iqbal Khan. He is a well-known theatre director. He's worked with many companies in the UK and abroad, so some of the ones that will be recognisable to you include the Royal Shakespeare Company, the Globe Theatre, the Birmingham Rep, the Lyric, the Bolton Octagon, and many more. He's obviously directed here in the UK, but also abroad in places like Paris and in Japan. He's also held residencies and delivered lectures at institutions which include Michigan State University and Lafayette College in the States. He was the Michael Douglas Visiting Artist at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And I'm very pleased to say that he has an honorary doctorate of arts from DMU. So we're particularly pleased to be welcoming him to be with us today. After Iqbal Khan, we will be joined by Professor James Shapiro, Dr. James Wolfe, who is an actor and director and has been involved with the Shakespeare's Globe Theatre for 20 years. James Wolfe has staged or taken part in over 100 performances of plays with Shakespeare's contemporaries for the special Red Not Dead series that the Globe hosts. Again, if you've never come across the Red Not Dead series, I highly recommend it. A wonderful chance to get to hear plays that are not, frequently brought on stage in the UK these days. With his company, The Dolphin's Back, he staged the first modern revival of Christopher Marlowe's wonderful play, The Massacre at Paris, at the Rosebank Playhouse on Bankside. He's also brought John Lilly's The Woman in the Moon to the candlelit Sam Wanamaker Playhouse. And that was the country's first professional production of Lilly in a major theatre since Lilly's own time. James Wallace has also presented his discoveries on John Lilly at the 2018 Shakespeare Association of America Conference, and also at the 2019 Early Modern Inns of Court and Circulation of Text Conference at King's College London. And turning next to our theatre historian, we will be welcoming James Shapiro, who I momentarily introduced earlier. He is a professor of English at Columbia University in the States and a very well-known author of many books on Shakespeare, including the prize-winning 1599, A Year in the Life of William Shakespeare, 1606, The Year of Lear, and most recently, Shakespeare in a Divided America, which came out last year and was selected as one of the 10 best books of the year by the New York Times. He's been awarded Guggenheim, Cullman, and NEH fellowships, and he's been inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He serves on the board of directors for the Royal Shakespeare Company, and he's a Shakespeare Scholar in Residence at the Public Theatre in New York. And then last, but by no means least, we also have Professor Lucy Monroe, another theatre historian, again, a well-established and important voice in the field of early modern theatre history. Again, Lucy has written many books, including about Children of the Queen's Revel, a Jacobean theatre repertory, a book on archaic style in early modern literature, and most recently, and I have to confess of particular interest to myself, last year she brought out with Arden Shakespeare her book on Shakespeare in the Theatre, The King's Men, which is a study of the performance practices, cultural context, and political pressures that helped to shape and reshape the plays of Shakespeare between 1603 and 1642. So as you can see, we've got a very exciting lineup of panelists here to talk with us today about theatre in time of plague. And just to kind of give everybody a little reminder of what the shape of the event will be, in a moment I will be introducing Iqbal to give his thoughts on reflections on what it's been like to be a theatre practitioner during the current pandemic and the closure of theatres, will then be turned into James Wallace for similarly his reflections on it in terms of now. And then we'll be turning to our theatre historians. So James Shapiro will be talking first, thinking a bit about the impact of plague upon Shakespeare in Shakespeare's own time. And similarly, Lucy, thinking about what it was like for those contemporaries of Shakespeare, as well as himself, when they had those periods where they could not access their kind of usual place of work in the form of the theatres of early modern London. And then the final kind of sections of the event, we're going to be having a bit of a discussion between the panelists. So after they've all spoken, we're going to invite the practitioners to question the theatre historians and the theatre historians to question the practitioners. And then finally, we'll be opening it up to you, the attendees. And so you'll have the opportunity to put questions in the chat, which I will be able to then share with the panel for them to think about and reflect on together. So as I said, an exciting lunchtime ahead of us here. And therefore, it's my great pleasure to start by welcoming Iqbal. And Iqbal, to invite you to, as I say, share with us your thoughts and reflections on what this last very challenging year for many people, both personally and professionally, has been like for you. So Iqbal, over to you.
Thank you, Siobhan. Thank you very, very much. And happy birthday, Shakespeare. Yes, it's a very, very big thing to talk about, and it's very hard to talk about what's happened in a time of nothing in some ways. But if I can, what I'd like to focus on at this stage, and then I'll hopefully get the chance to talk about other things later, is just something to do with my sense of the mental health of freelancers and the vulnerability that I have witnessed and I've experienced in this time, and to do it by talking about what I was doing just as we went into lockdown. Now, what I was doing was I was working on a production of Tartuffe. We had presented it at the RSC at the Swan a few months before, and it was now due to begin tour at the Birmingham Rep. It was the beginning of a new episode at that theatre with a new artistic director, and this was the first that he programming. It was getting a new life for this production. Our was set it also, as we were not only a tour planned, we also had with some professional stage for the very first time. And they'd negotiated their fears, they'd built up a resilience and a robustness and found a joy and a hunger. Our final run through in the rehearsal was ablaze with life. And it was shared by only those few who shared the rehearsal room. And we were ready to birth it. We hungered for our audience, because it's in that interaction that we learn more about the life of the piece and about ourselves. And we have the opportunity to share our work, to share our enthusiasms. Now, lockdown was announced on the eve of us entering our technical week. That final day in the rehearsal room was the first time our musicians gathered. Peter, our MD, had flown in from India the week before, and he had been quarantining for a week. And our company, most of them knew, or well, a lot of them knew, were hearing the music for the first time. And we just sat and enjoyed it. Now, one of our lead actors had decided the previous evening to pull out of the production. He had parents, vulnerable parents, whose health he didn't want to risk. And he had wanted the decision to be made for him because it seemed inevitable that lockdown was coming. But the facade and the illusion continued, and he finally had to make the heartbreaking decision himself. He felt he was betraying us. He was in tears. He wrote a letter to the company that I read out on the final morning. We all knew that we would be compelled to join him when others had made it, the government, etc., had made it impossible for us to continue. We understood this actor's intense mental anguish, and still we slightly resented him taking the dream away too early. So we heard that music, we clung to the sounds, the ache and the joy of the notes, and somewhere we knew we'd never hear them again. We were grateful and bereft. Like a lot of others at that time, we imagined that we hoped that it was only an interruption. And we set up a WhatsApp group to continue to nurse the flame between us. But a part of my job is always to manage the anxiety of others. I understood what was going on in the wings, as it were, but I always have to sort of keep alive as a director the sense that the impossible can happen, to allow the actors the freedom to leap. And it always feels to me that this delicate balance, the end, as we moved into as we had to lock down, as it were, everything, it always feels to me it's like an image of our own mortality. It's inevitable that we will be interrupted, but we always assume and prepare and commit to our tomorrows. And the paradox of our work as artists, freelance artists generally, is that it's always about play and vocation, delight and a kind of annihilating service to others. It's the celebration of self and the displacement of selves. It costs us an enormous amount. Now, this might sound very indulgent, but it is the truth as I've experienced it. It does cost artists an enormous amount, and we are embarrassed, as I just was, to admit this. We have this impulse that you can pay what you can. It's not a real job. It's not serious, and yet, to us, it really is sacred. We're not often thinking of building careers. We're building, dreaming, and critiquing worlds. To stop is catastrophic, and one of the major challenges we have in our industry as freelancers is having a sense of agency in our lives. We're always grateful for the opportunity, the privilege to participate. This makes this community of freelancers extraordinarily vulnerable, woundable. We are filled with the spirit of the amateurish, of the amateur. We make from love, and it's very hard. And we've had plenty of time to reflect on this over this year. It's very hard to know how to value this. The structural expectation in our systems is that from freelancers is that we'll essentially be ignored, and we imagined that we would. I think a lot of us imagined that we would be, because our voices, when we're not on a platform, have never been systematically prized. And I suppose that is the greatest promise of this period, this crisis, this absence, is that we've finally had the space to coordinate our thoughts, to confer as a community. It feels to me, it has felt to me, that our absence has been significantly noted, and I feel there's both a political and an institutional recognition of the essential things we do. Our project as artists is of enormous value to communities and individuals. It feels to me that there's an enormous ache for us to return, to gather, to console, to enlighten, and to delight, to develop ourselves and our communities, and to make sense of this being. And I mean, I think I've been relatively lucky in the sense that I have had projects that I've been able to nurture, conversations about actual work that will happen at some point, But I am terrified for the generation that is coming into this industry at this time, because their opportunities have vanished. But I have been involved in many conversations about how this business is constructed. Often we're too busy doing it to think about how it's done and why it's done and what systematic changes we can make to the structure of things to allow for change to happen quicker. And it feels to me like that those conversations have happened. And so for that generation that is very vulnerable at the moment, the new generation of artists that are coming in, I hope they're coming into an industry that is responding much more seriously to issues of equality, issues of a broadening of representation, etc. And I hope there'll be many more pathways for these people as they come into our industry. I fear that because of the financial pressures as we limp our way back into life, that a lot of our industry might prioritize the commercial, and I hope it doesn't. I hope we take the opportunity to risk now, to enliven and not to step backwards. Yeah, and so I'm at that place now where I'm going into a rehearsal for a play. In a couple of months, I'm planning another one, and I'm doing it all in a spirit of sort of leaping back into life rather than limping back into life. Thank you.
Thank you, Iqbal. Really, very moving actually hearing you talk about that initial experience of being kind of deprived of the opportunity to kind of complete your work and to take it forward, but also kind of very interesting to hear you talking about how we might turn this into an opportunity. And I think what you were saying there about that desire for there to be, well, the braveness to take risk and to think about let's see what we can do to change our industry, having had to put it on pause in the ways that have happened, is really fascinating. So I hope we will get to pick that up. But in the meantime, thank you very much for a really fascinating sort of starting position of what it's been like for you during this very challenging time.
Thank you.
I'd like to now bring in next James Wallace. So James, as we mentioned, has done lots of work with places like Shakespeare's Globe. And again, James, you've been facing the same challenge, I guess, of suddenly this halting to the world that you love from its function in the usual way. And again, it's just been really fascinating to hear what that experience has been like for you. So, James, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. After Iqbal, I thought that was brilliant, and I can see how emotional you are. And I sort of understand that, actually. And it's only talking in this sort of forum where that, for me, comes back up, because I've been sort of repressing it since we locked down. When just to be very honest about myself, when we went into lockdown, I thought we'd gone in too late. I've been sort of, tweeting to ask people to close their theatres. I think, Iqbal, your lead actor who pulled out, what a difficult thing to do. And I think he's a hero for doing that, for taking that responsibility, because theatres just gave up their responsibility to government to decide whether to close or not. It's like we're in an industry that hasn't had Ibsen's Enemy of the People or even Jaws or something, rather than taking responsibility. And I just want to praise those theatres who did choose to close early, before the government realised on that Sunday that they'd been modelling influenza and not COVID, and did a screeching U-turn, and then on the Monday told the audience not to go to theatres. And that's the Arcola Theatre, who closed on the Sunday, and a couple of smaller theatres, the Turbine Theatre and Absolute Theatre and Global Origins. They cancelled their events earlier when they didn't have to. There were 3 other theatres who did close early. The Old Vic, but saying because they weren't getting their audience because of transport issues. They didn't mention anything about the safety of their audience. And also the Park Theatre at the young Vic. And again, that was because a couple of the actors called in sick and were isolating. And I think those actors were heroes, because it's an incredibly difficult thing to do, to not put the show on. It goes against everything, you know, we believe in. I've just got a text up on the Saturday before we closed. I texted, this is how I felt at the time: ashamed of my profession today, when not a single one of these theatres showed the awareness or care to take the lead when the government was clearly wrong. They're glad of its U-turn, because this was a time when theatres were already obviously closed in Italy and Spain and France, but they'd also closed on Broadway or in Ireland. So anyway, that I think perhaps like the lead actor Iqbal in your show, I have an elderly mother who I look after. She's 88 with dementia, so I was acutely aware in the weeks leading up to lockdown of looking after her. That became entirely my priority. I'd spend a couple of weeks stocking up, and I locked down a week before everybody else and didn't go out for 3 months. So when lockdown came, I just hid. I wasn't interested in seeing any Zoom shows. I did try seeing one Zoom reading, which didn't appeal to me. Everybody doing Shakespeare's sonnets just didn't appeal to me. I felt very disconnected, and I just sort of had my head under the duvet for 2 months, watching the the numbers of coronavirus cases. But after a couple of months, I think a fear of death meant I started thinking, well, I better try and get those things done that I haven't been able to get together beforehand. So I had some research about this playwright, John Lilly, that I've been fiddling about with for 3 or 4 years, and I started working on that. I could do that for about a month. And then a lot of the time I was just, thank God for the internet. I don't know, Hamlet's the king of infinite space and can be bounded in a nutshell. He didn't have Google Maps or the internet. So I've just found myself driving around on Google Maps, where I grew up in Brazil, just driving around my old childhood haunts there for about 3 months, just escape, really. But for about 9 months, I was just sat cross-legged on my bed, eating biscuits, not interested in theatre at all. It was only actually after Christmas, I suppose, with the hope of the vaccine, that everything I'd repressed started coming back. I started dreaming very intensely about rehearsals and theatre again. This whole idea that theatre, that society needs theatre. I mean, I don't think society needs theatre. But I think we want theatre, we crave theatre. We don't need it, we want it. And it's it's not a healthy meal to keep us going. It's a big, thick, gooey slice of chocolate cake that we desire. Theatre needs society. We need people again. That's what we want. And the number of people who say what they really miss is the theatre bar afterwards, just talking, just being with each other. I do hope that the people who suffered most, I've already had a career, so I've been lucky, but the people who suffered most have been are the young. As Iqbal was saying, I've been teaching in drama school. I'm gutted that I couldn't give any of those guys a chance in Red Not Dead. I hope they're not neglected. It's 2 years of drama students have had it really, really rough. As I was listening to you, Iqbal, I was just wondering if there's a way even just to invite young drama students, those people who just left, are leaving this summer or left last summer, just invite them into the rehearsal room, even if you can't give them a job. Just bring them in, let them see other actors working, let them feel part of it. And looking forward to things starting again. I can't imagine. It feels to me, for myself, that everything's sort of over. Really, Red Not Dead isn't happening this year. I can't realistically. Now I look after my mum. I can't even realistically see myself working for any time in the future. But I'll carry on with my search. The research, the National Archives are open. I've booked in on Tuesday, and I'll carry on doing the sort of stuff I can do at home. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, James. Well, again, it's so interesting to hear how challenging this year has been and the massive changes that it's made for people who are involved in theatre. And you know, I'm really sorry to hear that you think you might not be able to go back into that kind of the practice. But I'm delighted to hear that your work on John Lilly and that way of contributing to what we know about Shakespeare theatre world, that is going to continue. But again, you raised some really interesting points there about, you know, what happens to this younger generation of people wanting to come into the theatre industry, and also that question of, you know, what theatre is for us, and how, again, having the absence of theatre, how that has led to us reflecting on what is its place, what is its role in relation to society. So again, I think there's lots of food for thought in what you've been talking about there, and an interesting kind of dialogue that you're setting up with some of the issues that Iqbal was raising. So I hope when we get to the panel version and we're all talking to each other, that we can kind of explore some of those ideas that you both have, particularly about the future and what maybe needs to change in the theatre industry and what can be done for that kind of younger generation of people, or the newer generations of people joining it. I hope we can pick those up again there. But for now, thank you very much, James. So that is our theatre practitioners reflecting on now and the very difficult circumstances that those involved in the theatre industry have been facing during the COVID pandemic and the series of lockdowns and obviously the closure of the theatres. We're going to turn now to think about what it was like in Shakespeare's day, when, again, terrible disease in the form of the plague likewise closed down playhouses for prolonged periods of time, preventing kind of the players from following their usual industry in London. And we're going to start first with Professor James Shapiro. So James, if we can invite you to come to the screen now, it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts about the kind of then versus the now of how theatre copes or not with the pressure of a terrible plague.
Thank you. Very powerful talks by both Iqbal and James, and my contribution as well is going to focus on the young and on the freelancers. When lockdown first began over a year ago, there was a meme that circulated. Many of you will recall, it's still circulating, that Shakespeare wrote King Lear during the pandemic. And the underlying message, I suspect, of that meme was, you had better have something to show for yourself during the quarantine than simply baking sourdough bread. But that meme was fake news. Shakespeare did not write King Lear during the pandemic. He wrote it in the spring, summer, fall of 1605, and that had followed 18 calm months of freedom from the plague that had begun in 1603 and had petered out a year after that. King Lear was probably in repertory at the Globe Theatre in the summer of 1606 when plague returned to London. Once plague deaths rose to over 30 a week, the authorities closed the playhouses. Then as now, the numbers were published, letting people know how many people were dying in London of plague. Shakespeare, as a shareholder in the King's Men, part owner of the Globe, lost a lot of money from that shutdown. But I find it very hard to feel sorry for a financially secure, middle-aged Shakespeare who could afford to live in an upscale London neighborhood and could absorb the losses. And he and his fellow shareholders knew that they were deep-pocketed, more so than rival companies like the Boys companies. And as they withstood the financial strain of the plague, other companies went belly up and they thrived. There's a better and less well-known story about Shakespeare and the plague that I'd like to share with you, one that also happens to be true. And it's a lot closer to the challenges that young actors and writers, those without work or savings thanks to COVID-19, are now facing. And it dates back to the early summer of 1592, when Shakespeare was a freelancer in his late 20s. He was living and working as an actor and as a playwright in London, having done so for 3 years ago, having left behind in Stratford his wife and 3 young children. A freelancer's life as an actor in Elizabethan London in 1592 wasn't easy. The half dozen or so shareholders who made up each Elizabethan playing company and pooled expenses and profits would employ up to a dozen or so hired men to flesh out their ranks for each production, depending upon the casting demands of that day. The pay for an actor per day, this was a gig economy essentially, was a shilling. And if the year was a good year, you could make as much as 12 to 14 pounds, more than a day laborer, far less than a schoolmaster. It was a precarious life made worse by periodic closures due to plague or government crackdown, or when a scandalous play caused outrage. One of the sadder letters that I've read from the Times comes from the accomplished actor Richard Jones, who begs for a loan so he could join a playing company heading to the continent. He writes, "For here I get nothing. Sometimes I have a shilling a day and sometimes nothing, so that I live in great poverty." Shakespeare himself must have been unusually ambitious and tireless too, because when his fellow hired actors relaxed or caroused at the end of a long day, he went off to write plays, sometimes in collaboration with other dramatists. The pay per play was a modest £6. And when you split that between 2 or 3 playwrights, it really didn't amount to much. The scholarly consensus these days is that Shakespeare either wrote, co-authored, or contributed a few scenes to, in the years 1589 to 92, to Arden of Faversham, the first part of the contention of the 2 famous houses of York and Lancaster, the true tragedy of Richard, Duke of York, Taming of the Shrew, Comedy of Errors, Henry VI, Edward III, 2 Gentlemen of Verona, and perhaps Titus Andronicus as well. We don't really know the order in which they're written, and perhaps 1 or 2 were drafted a little earlier or a little later. But my point is, his pay from all this writing came to little more than he was earning at the time as an actor, perhaps £15 a year, maybe less. And there weren't enough hours in the day for Shakespeare to earn more than this. The only way he could earn more was to become management rather than labor, that is to say, to become a shareholder. But there's no evidence that by 1592, anyone had asked Shakespeare to become a shareholder in their playing company. And the truth is, at that moment, he was not the best playwright in England. I suppose if you asked around, you would hear people say, well, Robert Greene was better, Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Kidd for sure, Peele, Lodge, John Lilly, of course, James will remind us, and Thomas Watson, little known today. Still, he was doing pretty well, about as well as an overworked freelancer holding down 2 full-time jobs could do that. But this all ended in June of 1592, when plague suddenly arrived in London that had not seen an outbreak this viral since the 14th century and the Great Plague of 1348. The authorities first closed the playhouses until September, then until December, when colder weather usually killed off the plague, but the outbreak persisted. Though the theaters were open briefly, they closed again in February 1593, as dozens and then hundreds of Londoners died every week. By August of 1593, the weekly deaths in London had risen to a terrifying 1,800. In that month, the owner of the shuttered Rose Theatre, Philip Henslow, wrote to his son-in-law, the star tragedian Edward Alleyne, that, and I quote, "Robert Brown's wife in Shoreditch and all her children and household be dead and her doors shut up. Brown, an actor, had been away touring on the continent when his entire family and household were wiped out. It was a very scary time. The challenges facing the young Shakespeare were daunting. He couldn't write plays on spec at this volatile time, as they were written for particular playing companies and sometimes star actors in mind. And who would pay for them? Companies that left town to tour in the safer provinces didn't need new plays. They just staged the same old favorites in every town that allowed them to perform. And he couldn't earn a penny from acting unless he toured himself. And the rates for hired men who went on the road were half the rates of London, notoriously low. And had he toured, he would have cut himself off from the opportunities to collaborate, as well as cutting himself off from the books which he depended for the play's source material. Yet, remaining in London put his life in peril. And though his income had dried up, he had many mouths to feed. Not only his wife and 3 young children, his father had fallen into debt and couldn't lead the family home for fear of arrest. So Shakespeare had to support, almost surely, his parents, his 3 younger siblings, as well as his own family. And surely the thought would have occurred to him, as plague numbers ebbed and flowed, and those teasing reopenings of the playhouses turned into renewed closings, it was time to get out, leave the contagious city, and find a better way to use his talents. And he could have given up the writing life and gone back to Stratford-upon-Avon, perhaps working as a school teacher or in his father's trade, making gloves. He stayed in London, wrote 2 extraordinary poems, Venus and Adonis and Lucrece, but he made only a pittance from them, perhaps a few pounds from the dedicatory, the Earl of Southampton, but his publishers were the ones who made the money from these volumes. And as the plague persisted into late winter of 1593 and the spring of 1594, it's hard to imagine a future for Shakespeare in the theater, either as an actor or a self-supporting writer. The month that Shakespeare turned 30, in April 1594, plague deaths finally dropped below 30 and playgoing resumed in London. 12,000 or so Londoners were dead out of a population of 150,000 or so. And most significantly for Shakespeare, his rivals were no longer working. Marlowe was dead, Kidd was dying, Lodge and Lilly had stopped writing plays. Watson almost surely died of the plague. So Shakespeare had what I would describe as an extraordinarily lucky pandemic. He didn't die. All his rivals disappeared. And soon after the reopening of the theaters, he was invited by the Chamberlain's men to join their ranks as a shareholder. He was no longer a freelancer. He would be a shareholder in their company, and 5 years later would become co-owner of the Globe Theatre as well. Plague could have easily struck again at any time, but it did not return to London until 1603. And within a year or so of the end of plague, Shakespeare had already finished 2 of his most extraordinary plays, Romeo and Juliet and Midsummer Night's Dream. But I wonder if a maddened, flea-ridden, rat-carrying plague fled down one muddy lane in Southwark rather than another, Shakespeare's name might have been relegated to a footnote, and we might be celebrating Thomas Watson as England's greatest playwright, or perhaps venerating another now nameless upstart. Some find their health and livelihood and families destroyed during a pandemic. Others, including Shakespeare, were luckier. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Again, a really interesting story. And I think it's really wonderful that you managed to tell a story that people just focus on less, which is those early days of Shakespeare, and that point where his career could not have been the one it ended up being. And how fortune was part of that, the good fortune of having survived the plague, of others not being there, so that the field was kind of opened up for him and other younger kind of writers and actors. So yeah, really lots of food for thought again, I think, but also fascinating to see that connection between you thinking about what it was like to be in that precarious position and what Iqbal and James have already been talking about in terms of where we go next, what's going to come out of this this pausing of kind of business as usual. So yeah, I think we're going to have some interesting topics to pick up. But for now, thank you very much, James. And I'd like to now introduce Lucy to give the final of our kind of thought pieces, again reflecting specifically on Shakespeare's day and the experience of Shakespeare's contemporaries when it came to these plague-induced closures of theatre. So yes, over to you, Lucy. Lucy, you're still on mute. I think you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I should say I live on a railway line, so I muted myself just in case the trains went past. And then in classic style, forgot that I'd done such a thing. So I think James Shapiro and I had fairly similar instincts in thinking of places to go when we were invited to talk about Shakespeare in a time of plague. And one of the things I'd like to do is to go back to the letters of Edward Alleyne, who James mentioned, and to dig into those a little bit more, because these are extraordinarily powerful documents in giving us a sense of what it was like to be in the theatre industry in a time of plague. And there's a set of, I think, around 4 letters written between Edward Alleyne, his wife Joan, and her stepfather Philip Henslowe, who was an investor in playhouses and theatre companies and was Alleyne's business partner over a number of years. And these letters were written in August and September 1593, around the height of the plague in London, and a period when the playhouses and much of social life in London was shut down. And as James mentioned, this is a period in which Shakespeare himself is active in the theatre company, in theatre industry, but he's nowhere near as prominent or as successful as Alleyne at this point. Alleyne is probably the best known actor kind of operating in 1593. And Alleyne went on tour during this period. He was in the southwest of England in August and September 1593, and he was writing letters back home to Southwark, although not as often as his family hoped that he would, and receiving their letters in return. And a group of these letters are preserved in the archives at Dulwich College, the foundation that Alleyne himself set up. And what these letters convey really vividly are some of the human dimensions of this crisis, the kinds of emotions that people maybe experienced, but also the way in which the crisis persisted alongside the everyday. So these letters are full of inquiries about health, entreaties to God to protect them, and as I said, complaints that Edward doesn't write as often as he might. In particular, they convey a vivid sense of what it might have been like to be in the City of London or in its suburbs in the midst of the plague. So Edward writes to Joan, "Keep your house fair and clean, which I know you will, and every evening throw water before your door and in your backside, and have in your windows good store of rue and herb of grace, and with all the grace of God, which must be obtained by prayers. And so doing, no doubt, but the Lord will mercifully defend you." And there's a sense here of the protections that people look to, the helplessness that people fear in the face of disease. And the idea of keeping the house as clean as possible and as fragrant as possible might be a way of preserving oneself and one's household. As James mentioned, Philip writes to Edward with news of the dead. So he writes with news of the actor Robert Brown, and he mentions the numbers of the dead, but also in one letter conveys a sense that this information might have been being controlled. He writes, "As for news of the sickness, I cannot send you no just note of it, because there is commandment to the contrary. But as I think doth die within the city and without of all sicknesses, to the number of 17 or 1800 in 1 week." In another letter of the same month, Philip writes to Edward, "Thanks be unto God, we are all at this time in good health in our house, but round about us it hath been almost in every house about it, and whole households dead. And yet my friend the Bailey doth escape, but he smells monstrously for fear, and dares stay nowhere." And Philip Henslowe's letters convey almost a kind of gallows humour about the individual's responses to the pandemic and the danger that they're in, which also comes through in play texts. There isn't really a great plague play. There are plays in which the plague kind of features as a subtext, or is mentioned or alluded to. But we get these sardonic allusions. So Lording Barry, in a Jacobean play called Ram Alley, has a character comment, "I dwindle as a new player does at a plague bill certified 40. And Thomas Middleton in Your Five Gallants, also an early Jacobean play, writes, "'Tis e'en as uncertain as playing, now up, now down, for if the bill rise to above 30, here's no place for players." Much of the great writing about plague comes in pamphlet form, with writers like Thomas Dekker being particularly prominent. And Dekker in texts like The Wonderful Year, which was published in 1603, and wonderful here meaning terrible, awful in the old senses of the word. And he writes about the diseased city, and talks about the groans of the raving sick, in every house grief striking up an alarum, and writes that in this pitiful, or rather pitiless perplexity stood London, forsaken like a lover, forlorn like a widow, and disarmed of all comfort. So Thomas Dekker, a freelance playwright, turns his hand to writing pamphlets in these times of plague, and as I've said, gives us one of the most vivid pictures of what it might have been like to be in the midst of things. But as I said, Henslowe turns more towards the mordant in his writing about the plague. And he's also very matter of fact. In September 1593, he writes to Edward that almost all of his neighbours are dead of the plague, and that 2 of his female servants have had it and lived. But he thanks God that the rest of his household are in good health. The letters also convey a sense that the companies talked about each other and gossiped about each other. So, as James mentioned, Philip reports on the death of the actor Robert Brown's wife and children, and Brown was away performing in Germany at this time. In September, Philip Henslowe reports that Pembroke's men, which you desire to know where they be, they're all at home, and have been this 5 or 6 weeks, for they cannot save their charges with travel, as I hear, and were fain to pawn their apparel for their charge. So some of the companies were in such financial straits that they didn't even have the wherewithal to tour to support themselves, or that touring wouldn't make that much difference. As I've said, one of the things that's very clear is the sense of the everyday. So Edward sends messages back in his letters from Tours. He sends clothes back to London with his letters, such as a white waistcoat, which he says is a trouble to me to carry it. He signs a letter of the 1st of August 1593, from Bristow, this Wednesday after St. James's Day, being ready to begin the play of Harry of Cornwall. And we get a sense of Alain scribbling letters just before he's about to go on stage. And Joan and Philip fret about his health while he's away. Philip writes in a letter of the 14th of August, "We heard that you were very sick at Bath, and that one of your fellows would fain to play your part for you, which was no little grief unto us to hear. But thanks be to God for amendment, for we had feared it much, because we had no letter from you when the other wives had letters sent." And I like this sense of all of the wives of the players are getting letters, and Joan Alain is desperate for her own letter, having heard rumours that Edward is in poor health. And there's this sense of life going on in the midst of everything. So Edward asked Joan to let my orange tawny stockings of woolen be dyed a very good black, against I come home to wear in the winter. And he asks after his garden, reminding Joan to sow spinach in September, for then is the time, adding, I would do it myself, but we shall not come home until All Hallows Tide. Philip writes with news of the tenants' difficulties in paying their rent, and notes that in September a joiner is late with the work that he's supposed to be doing for Edward, but we bear with him because his house is visited. That is, members of his household are suffering from the plague. So Edward Alain's letters and the letters of those who wrote to him give us this sense of the way that the theatre industry attempted to carry on in the face of the plague. But it also gives us maybe a sense of the story from the other perspective, from the relatively privileged, in contrast with Shakespeare, who, as James Shapiro was saying, is very much in the position of the vulnerable at that point. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
thank you, Lucy. Again, full of fascinating insights, and wonderful in both the modern and early modern senses to get that insight into the impact of the plague on that kind of everyday life. So what it was like for those who are around those in the theatre industry, and just what it was like to be in London in that period. And again, fascinating to see that combination of the being the matter of fact about it, the turning to humour to deal with it, but also that perennial attempt to keep danger at bay if they could, and trying to find a way in the case of the actors to continue with your work in whatever fashion you could. So we've had 4 really interesting kind of position pieces or talks from our guests so far to kind of outline some of the impacts of plague when it came to the theatre in Shakespeare's day, but also the kind of impacts this more modern pandemic has been having. And I'd like now to invite all the panelists to kind of rejoin us to come together. And we want to kind of give the, if you like, the practitioners a chance to quiz the historians, and the historians a chance to quiz the practitioners. And if maybe we could ask Iqbal and James Wallace, is there anything that you would like to ask of Lucy and James Shapiro, having heard what they were saying about the experience in Shakespeare's day and for Shakespeare's contemporaries? Is there anything that struck you there as you were listening that you thought it would be interesting to hear more about? So I don't know if either of you have a question ready.
Can you,
James, do you want to go first?
sorry, can you go on, James?
I'm just curious to know when did theatre fully come back? Do we know from Rose records when audiences really picked up again after 1592, 93?
Do you want to answer that, Lucy?
I'm trying to remember whether I know precisely. I think relatively quickly once the theatres reopen. But I'd need to go back to, as you say, Henslow's diary may well have some ways in which we've been more precise about this and actually look at how quickly it comes back.
It's a bit fuzzy. It looked like the plane companies that survived the plague ended up performing together in some cases at Newingham Butts, a mile south of London. It looked like companies were being reformed at this time. So I think it was a very unstable period. But from the records of receipts of Henslow's diaries, it's pretty clear that audiences craved that luscious chocolate cake, as you put it, and went back to the theater. And by 1594, it certainly looks like play production and play going, late 1594 was up to speed. In other words, people were not panicked about cramming into a theater unmasked, if you will, with 2,500 other people.
Yeah, I've actually got Reginald Folkes' edition of Henslow's diary on the table next to me here. And so some of the notes that he has when the theatre is coming back again. So he's got some notes of the Earl of Sussex's men in December 1593, who at a glance look like they're doing pretty well with plays like The Pinder of Wakefield, a play called Godspeed the Plough, Huon of Bordeaux, Richard the Confessor, Georgia Green, King Lud. And then there's these records of companies working together. So the Queen's men and Sussex's men together in Easter 1594. And then later in that year, the Admiral's men and the Chamberlain's men together, as James was saying, in Newington Butts. When we have records of them playing The Jew of Malta, the early Hamlet play, and various others. And I think what James is saying about the idea that Shakespeare is one of the sort of the last men left standing when the theatres reopen again in 1593 is really important. There is a kind of a shift of generations at that point in terms of who's active and writing plays in London.
I have a question that I'd like to throw at James and Iqbal based on what Lucy and I were describing, which is when the theaters reopen, are they going to show the greatest hits from the pre-pandemic era, or are audiences craving something new? And that is a question that the next few months might reveal to us, but I'm curious what, as theater practitioners, you think theater is going to be doing in the coming months, or should be doing.
James, shall I go first, if that's okay? Yeah, I think there's a big distinction between what they should be doing and what I fear they will be doing. Because there was a whole raft of projects that were delayed and are now slowly coming back online, as it were. Now, the effect of that is to be loyal to the practitioners that you had engaged to begin with, but also to not take cognizance of everything that's happened in the meantime. However, what I have noticed is that a lot of theatres, like the Rep, for instance, with My Tartuffe, have now cancelled those plans and are starting anew, because there is a need to respond to and to create work that comes out of where we are now, the sensibility now. But the calculation has to be that to do plays that are too commercial at the moment is a bit of a waste of time, because you're not going to have full houses. So actually, it is an opportunity to mine the seams, to maybe test the margins, and to do something a bit more radical and a bit more. And the voices of freelancers in this period has been so elevated, so loud, that I think they have to take cognizance of new ways of doing things to sort of give those people platforms. So I hope, even though every economic instinct will suggest to them that they need a time of consolation, of consolidating financial losses, I hope they'll play the long game and realize that they can seed much more growth if they risk now.
Yeah, really interesting. James, did you want to come back on that? Is there anything else that you wanted to say?
No, well, just if there are any young actors watching this, just left drama school. When I left, I had something that I used to find very useful, which is when you leave drama school, you're still an apprentice for 7 years. But you don't have to have immediate success. So if you've lost a year, or going to lose 2 years from this, it's from your apprenticeship. It's a long game, and just keep going, keep fighting, keep going to see stuff, keep reading stuff with your fellow actors, and I do hope that as Iqbal was saying, that theatre should be taking risks, but also that they're not risk averse by cutting casts, that they find ways to bring younger actors in, even if it's just to be in the rehearsal room, just to be around other actors, just to be part of it, and carry on that sort of apprenticeship.
Yeah. Well, again, thinking about apprenticeship, again, that's another connection back to the early modern theatre world, where admittedly the apprenticeships tended to start younger than they do for us, but where that was a recognised part of how theatre worked, that you didn't get to that position of being a sharer until quite some way down the road in most people's career. But again, Lucy, is there anything else that you would want to ask kind of Iqbal and James about the now of kind of the impact of a pandemic on theatre?
Yeah, I mean, I was very moved by both of your talks, and that sense of just of how you come back from something like this, and how you rebuild. And I guess I'm kind of interested in some ways in that question of the kind of work that comes out and that goes on to be produced in the next few years. And one of the other memes that was going around, as well as one of the narratives that's going around, as well as the King Lear, King Lear was written in the pandemic kind of meme, was also the idea that, there are people writing their great pandemic novels and things like this. And I was struck when I was looking through materials that, and the way that people write plays in the early modern period is quite different, because they're often basing things on earlier sources, and by and large they're not writing kind of social realism. But the plague is always kind of around the edges. Even in a play like Johnson's Alchemist, the play is outside. The plague is outside, and it's kind of it's not the focus of the narrative. It's something that helps to propel it in some ways. So I guess I wonder whether we're going to be in a phase of sort of intense introspection, with people, very much producing kind of pandemic art, or whether actually we'll end up with something that's a reaction against that, a sense that people don't necessarily want to make pandemic art. They want to move on to something else.
Yeah, I mean, I get this from personally. I for most of the beginning of the lockdown, I, a little bit like James, really kind of embraced the silence. I'm pretty good at being on my own. I mean, I spend most of my time in companies, with companies, and being involved in very intricate conversations. And so when I have the opportunity to embrace the silence, I normally enjoy it. So weirdly, it was okay for me psychologically to have that space and to be forced to stop. And I think, rather than the tyranny of industry at a time where everything is stopped and you have to come back with something that demonstrates that you've used your time well, I think what might be more valuable in the long term is to have had the time to just reflect, and to not be doing theatre, and to be engaging in the why and the how we engage with each other. And whether that what comes of that is specifically pandemic work, or whether it's just a more nuanced engagement with the human condition, the joy of collecting and gathering, and embracing diversity and difference in that gathering. I mean, I hope that that's the way we'll go, and it will find joyful and subversive outlets. I'd be very surprised if we had a whole series of pandemic plays, people wearing masks and stuff like that, because I think that's the last thing people are going to want to see on a stage when they come back. But it can certainly be in the DNA of the plays. I don't know what you think, James.
Well, what you said, really. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to see any pandemic plays, but it has been a time of sort of reflecting and of thinking about what is important in your life, what are the things that are important to you, and so yeah. Hopefully, people will come out of it with a deeper sense of connection to their own thoughts and feelings.
Can I just ask? I was really intrigued by this old version of the word "wonderful."
Mm-hmm.
I've never come across that. That's really surprising that it was used in a certain way, and it's acquired a completely different meaning now. Could you just say a little bit more about that? The Wonderful Year is a incredibly resonant title for a new play.
Yeah, so this pamphlet that Thomas Becker writes in 1603, and 1603 is an epochal year anyway, because it's the death of Elizabeth I and the accession of James I, and the very widespread relief that it goes through peacefully. But yeah, wonderful in this period is something that causes you to, or can be something that causes you to feel wonder, and it's not necessarily a positive emotion. It's something that makes you feel awe, and that sort of unsettles you in certain.
And the sense of terror that is associated with that.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So wonderful. A synonym for the early modern use of the word might be terrifying, or terrible, again, in a kind of old sense of something that makes you feel terror rather than something that's just kind of awful. And terrible and wonderful have sort of gone in two different directions in terms of the way that their modern meaning has settled. that in the 16th, 17th century, they're much kind of closer to each other. Awful is another example. So awful is something that makes you feel awe rather than just being something.
And the sense of the sublime also has those sorts of resonances. Fascinating.
Yeah, and there is that sense of the particular kinds of emotions that draw you to what people later kind of think of as the sublime.
So, do you have any? Did you want to ask another question, Iqbal, of the historians, or likewise, Lucy, Joe Shapiro? Do you want to ask another question of the practitioners? Because in a moment we're going to open up the floor to our audience for their questions. But I want to give you all a chance if there's anything else you'd like to ask of each other first.
I thought it was very interesting that James focused on this idea that the theatre managers, as it were, the executive, were sort of financially invulnerable to the immediate effects, or maybe the long term effects. Were resilient, and actually, you focused on as you say, that generation of freelancers coming through, and how fragile it was or is that Shakespeare survived as an image of where we are now. I mean, as you say, the West End will survive. A lot of those theatres will remain, but how many? And they don't need to be Shakespeare's, obviously, but how many extraordinary talents will slip by? And how do we, as James was suggesting, how can we ensure that they are embraced? How, and apprenticeships and including them in our rooms seems to me a very simple but powerful way of trying to ensure that in some way that we are embracing them.
I just think then as now, the vulnerable are going to suffer. And I think that both in the United States and in the UK, many talented performers, dancers, singers, musicians, actors have moved back home to take care of loved ones or because they can't afford the rents of New York or London, and they will never return. And the talent drain will be felt for some time to come. I think the loss has to be acknowledged and not papered over. The other thing that pandemic does, we all focus on death and on the numbers, so to speak, of a pandemic. But pandemics also, like tsunamis, when they pull back the waters from the shore, reveal things that we haven't seen as clearly or should have seen as clearly. So I think theater going forward is going to be radically different, certainly in the United States, because of Black Lives Matter, because of social justice, because of income inequality, that have become so transparent that, if you will, the middle Americans who could turn a blind eye towards them no longer can. So I think it's almost a certainty that theater will not be showing people with masks. We're not going to focus on the pandemic. We're going to be focusing on what the pandemic has helped sear into the reality of our daily lives.
I think that's absolutely right. And actually, it's extraordinary how, if you look at the appointments in a lot of educational institutions and our theatre companies in this period, it has absolutely tried to respond to this absence that has traditionally been there. They're representing different experiences, and hopefully, as you say, searing it into the structural change that's required.
I wonder if there's any kind of hope with James. You were talking about rents and stuff. There are a lot of empty buildings now, a lot of empty shops, there'll be a lot of empty pubs. Whether there's an opportunity for people to do French shows, to take over spaces and put shows on themselves. I have a question for Lucy and James, which is do you get a sense from the plays after the 1592-34 plague? Do they change in the things they're looking at? Do they have different subject matters? Are audiences more interested in different sorts of things?
It's a bit difficult to say, but I think because you have that sort of shift of generations in terms of the playwrights who are active, and in some ways there's a sort of period between about 1593 and say 1597-98 where we've got Shakespeare's works, we've got a few things by other playwrights, but there's not that much sense of things kicking off in a distinctively different direction until you get to 1597, 98, 99, and then you get Chapman and you get Johnson, and a little bit later you get Marston and various other writers. And then there's a sense of things really kind of kicking off in a different sort of direction. And I don't know whether James would agree or not, but I think in some ways there is a slight sense of almost kind of treading water, Shakespeare aside.
I think there's evidence for that. If you look at Francis Mere's 1598 volume, looking back at the greatest for tragedy and comedy in London, and the names he names are all pre-1592, except for Shakespeare. And from 1592, well, maybe one or two exceptions, Johnson is beginning to write at this point, but there really is a hiatus there. The changing of the guard does not take place overnight. It takes a few years for the Deckers and the Haywards and the Johnsons to establish themselves. And I suspect that we're not going to see a radical change in the creative leadership in the theaters in the next 2 or 3 years of our day, but we will see that within 4 or 5 years. I think that's another lesson of the 1590s for us.
You see it somewhat around 1525 as well. There's a group of playwrights who die around that time. I mean, John Fletcher most notably dies in the height of the 1625 plague in August that year, supposedly because he stayed in London too long because he was getting a suit made and caught the plague while he was waiting. But there's a number who also drop out around that sort of time. So Middleton dies in the sort of mid 1620s as well. And it takes a few years then for people like Richard Broome, James Shirley, Philip Massinger in some sense as well, who has had a pre-plague career, but who takes a little bit of time to fully kind of embed. I mean, great as mid-1620s plays like A New Way to Pay Old Debts are. It maybe takes Caroline Theatre a little while to kind of fully settle itself after that upheaval and the loss of really central figures.
Well, and the new, as James was saying earlier on, and the new need the time for their apprenticeship. They need to, they need to come into the full muscle of their voices, which is exactly what I think will happen as this guard changes over the next year, over the next few years. Is there are lots of people who are potentially qualified to step into shoes, but who are limited in experience, and so I will imagine that it will take, as James Shapiro suggests, that a time for them to sort of fully be confident in their voices and to flex in an appropriate way.
Well, as we've got a little lull there, perhaps I might at this point kind of bring in some of the questions that have been coming up in the chat, and I don't know if we'll have time to go through them all, so apologies if you're someone who's posted something and we don't get to it, but I might start with one of the questions that somebody's posed for everybody, which is, how has living through a pandemic changed your appreciation of Shakespeare? Do you feel closer to him on a human level? whoever might like to take that one. So yeah, has it changed your appreciation of Shakespeare, our current experience? Obviously a tough one.
I'll foolishly take that question first. I don't have a relationship with Shakespeare. I have a relationship with particular plays, either as a cultural historian or more now as a theater practitioner advising companies. So, in a sense, what the plague has done in changing my relationship with Shakespeare in my work, say at the Public Theater in New York, is make me aware of the need to tease out from Shakespeare's plays the issues that are on the table in my culture right now, which are of inequality and xenophobia and division. So it has made me much more alert to plays that highlight that and to ways in which we can help reinforce community. And Shakespeare's plays are also about divisions and reconstituted communities. So I wish I had a better relationship with a 400-year-old dead person, but it's his plays that is all I got. And they have changed for me during the pandemic and will continue to change as the cloud lifts and we can see both our world and these plays more clearly.
I entirely agree with James on that, and I think the conjunction of the pandemic and Black Lives Matter and not having theatre in the same way just means that we can't go on in the same way. There are urgent questions and problems that we need to address. And the only thing that I would add is that a lot of my interaction with Shakespeare this year has been through teaching. And I've been teaching online. I've been teaching a new Shakespeare module that a colleague of mine has convened and put together, and I taught 3 weeks on it. And it's a module on Shakespeare and time. And one of the questions that I was exploring with the students throughout it was, well, where are we temporarily? Everything feels strange in terms of time at this moment. How do we reconceive the relationship between Shakespeare's time and our time? How do we even think about the workings of time at a time when time seems to have lost its meaning in various ways? I had students beaming in to a class on Teams from all sorts of parts of the world for whom it was a completely different time of day than it was for me in London when I was doing my teaching. And so I was teaching Comedy of Errors, I was teaching Pericles and Troilus and Cressida. And yes, just really having a lot of my assumptions around those texts completely unsettled for all this variety of reasons.
How about Iqbal or James? Any thoughts for you?
I completely agree about relating to him on a human level in terms of the hymn, the Shakespeare. I don't know what that is. It's a collection of works, unstable sites of meaning that have shifted all the time for me. It does feel to me at the moment where I feel the ache for that work now more than ever is in the realm of these big communities of artists coming together to make very, very complex experiences for people. I think we need that complexity in the world. I'm sorry to say. But the thing is, it doesn't need to be serious. They're such weird and messy pieces. They're metaphysical and scatological in an instant, and that's the most wonderfully humane. I mean, you talked about gallows humor earlier on. I think we need all of that now. It really. They're so bold. They're so joyful and disobedient. And I think all of those sorts of spirits are fantastic frames for our interactions in a rehearsal room and in a theatre. So I absolutely feel an ache to engage with that again.
Wonderful. And James Wallace, how about for you?
Well, I haven't really been engaging with Shakespeare that much for the past year, so I suppose I feel a bit more distant from his work. But in the last few days, I've some of Shakespeare's characters have been popping into my head, and they're people like Thersites. I'm sure there's some Cressida. Is it Apomantus in Time of Athens? But just the satirists and the critics and the people who want to tear it all down.
I love Thersites so much.
Yeah, a great character. Well, maybe I could take another question. And this question is aimed specifically at the historical context, but I'd be interested to know whether you think that it has some resonances for the present as well. This is from a PhD student. They're asking, what is the pan-European perspective? And I think they mean on the plague of the early modern period. Was continental Europe hit any harder than England? And did this shared theatrical culture? So although that question is obviously aimed at, if you like, the early modern period, I wonder again whether we think the pandemic is going to have any impact on the shared theatrical culture of now. So again, I don't know if you might like to go first, maybe either Lucy or James Shapiro, and then perhaps Iqbal or James Wallace.
I don't have any detailed information to hand about statistically how hard hit different parts of Europe were in the period. Obviously, the plague was something that was endemic in Europe in this period, and various countries had flare-ups at various points. But there is a sense that some English actors go to the continent when the playhouses in London are closed. Arguably irresponsibly, because they might, traveling players may well be helping to carry disease from place to place. But definitely a sense of a kind of a theatrical culture that is interwoven in various kinds of ways. We know of that there are plays that survive in German that seem to be adaptations of English plays, for example. We have lots of records of English plays on the continent, of continental European players coming to England. So there's a great project in there somewhere, actually, for a kind of a comparative, what is the impact of the plague on different theatrical cultures, and are these things linked?
Any thoughts about that, the modern perspective then? Do we think that the experience of the pandemic, obviously it's closed down theatres just about everywhere. Do we think there's going to be, when we're thinking about what comes next, again, do we think there's going to be any change into the shared theatrical culture? Because obviously James Shapiro has already mentioned how the particular context of, say, America, you think will have a particular impact on the way theatre evolves there. Do we think that's going to be the same in other parts of the world, like the UK?
It's really hard to say. It's really hard to say when you're in it. I mean, one of the things that I was very aware of when we were all sort of in lockdown around the world was that, I mean, I did a number of projects online with schools abroad in Canada and in Europe, and in a way that was extremely consoling, because you're sort of you feel like there's a shared human struggle going on, and an ability to sort of articulate things with each other about that. But as we come out differentially around the world, there is this horrible contest over resources that is beginning, and that really concerns me, because I think that will have an impact on how we sort of turn in and turn away from global communities, and I hope we can manage that transition. But I think we're in a very, very uncertain time at the moment, as different parts of the world come out in different ways. Yeah, I mean that contest over resources is really concerning.
Yeah, for for me, the issue is how individual governments are going to respond in sustaining the arts.
Yeah.
And I think James's suggestion that we have more pop-up theater, we have more community theater, we have more local theater is crucial. But I also think that, speaking as an American, my country has been behind your country in recognizing the importance of the arts. And it's not to say that Boris Johnson is fighting tooth and nail to support the arts, but Joe Biden, as progressive as he is not instituting measures to restore the performing arts in anywhere near what those arts need. And it's of deep concern to me. So I think there is no global theater community right now as we struggle for resources, both financial and medical. And we've been isolated from each other. I'm used to traveling around the world every year, and that is not happening. We're all turning inward in certain ways. And I should say that for the first time in 40 years, my research is focusing ever more on the situation, the political situation in the United States, rather than allowing myself the luxury of focusing on what's going on in 1599 or 1606 in London. I don't have that luxury. There's an urgency now that the pandemic has made clearer, and that is to fight tooth and nail for theater and the arts.
That's a really interesting perspective. Well, I suppose thinking back to the UK situation, you mentioned that you think that the government here has made bigger strides in terms of thinking about supporting the arts afterwards. But I'd be interested to know, in the case of Lucy, Iqbal, James, I mean, what is our prognosis for theatre in the UK post-pandemic? What kind of bounce back is there going to be? And when we talked about what happened in 1593 and the slow build back in some ways of the theatre industry in early modern London, how do we see that kind of building back the theatre in the UK post-pandemic?
Sorry, was that to me? The sound quality was very hard for me to hear.
Sorry, I'll repeat. How do we think that the build back of British theatre is going to work post-pandemic? How optimistic are we?
I don't know. I have no idea at all. I'm sort of sorry to hear that that in America that the arts aren't on Biden's agenda. I mean, it was such a part of the New Deal, coming out of recession then. I mean, that's I don't know if we'd have had Sam Wanamaker if it hadn't been for that. Just the. I hope that changes in America.
I've got to say that I mean I know these are very, very dark times and times of division and as James Shapiro, I'm sorry, I'll keep saying your whole name just to make sure that I'm making the distinction, but it is a time to fight, for a certain kind of equality now, but I'm very hopeful, actually. About how we come out of this, because as James was saying, I think the inequality is absolutely blatant and exposed now. I don't think people can make simply the economic commercial argument anymore. It's never going to wash again. Even a conservative government is using a different kind of vocabulary about the necessity to fund the arts more seriously, because it's an essential component of what it is to be, rather than the amount it contributes to the economy. And I sort of feel like things have discreetly changed now. So I am hopeful. I think it'll be an enormous struggle, and as we come out of this, and I think it'll be different in different places. but I really feel like that I'm very hopeful for that new generation that can get through this, and that's the most worrying thing. Is losing that diversity because of economic inequality, and can they be helped and supported to manage this transition? But the world that they're coming into, I think, the theatre world that they're coming into, the pathways available to them are greater than they've ever been before, in my experience.
Thank you. Well, I noticed that we're really out of time, so maybe a nice place to finish on that note of hope, of what we hope will be coming out the other side of the pandemic. And as I say, we're at our 2 o'clock finish. That for me, that just raced by. It was so lovely being able to listen to the 4 of you talking. So if I can thank you on behalf of all our attendees, I'll give you a little bit of applause if you won't be able to hear it from everybody else. Just say thank you again very much to Dr. Iqbal Khan, to James Wallace, to Professor James Shapiro and Professor Lucy Monroe. It's been a pleasure talking to you all, and I hope this has been a similarly enjoyable listen for those of you in our audience. So thank you very much, everybody. This is the end of our lunchtime panel on Theatre in a Time of Plague.
Goodbye. Take care.